All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Stephen Ritchie, Director of ITS Irvine, and it's my honor today to welcome to ITS our distinguished seminar speaker, Dr. Federico Vaca, who is Professor and Executive Vice Chair of the Department of Emergency Medicine at the UCI School of Medicine. Dr. Vaca is a board-certified emergency medicine physician and physician scientist. He has extensive experience in the topic of today's seminar, which I believe is really important and exciting for all of us to learn more about as transportation engineers and planners. Dr. Vaca has served as a medical fellow for US DOT National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in Washington, D.C. And for several decades through his research at both UCI and Yale Schools of Medicine, safety, adolescent development and behaviors that influence the risk of motor vehicle crash and injury, as well as health disparities in alcohol use disorders, impaired driving, and crash. Dr. Vaca has an extensive resume, very prestigious. I just mentioned a couple of other things. He's chaired and served on several NIH scientific review committees, chaired national expert panels directed by TRB, and served on the board of Scientific Counselors for CDC, National Center for Injury Prevention and Control. And one thing that is not in his abstract for today's seminar, but most recently he was appointed as president of the prestigious International Association to the Advancement of Automotive Medicine. So we have Professor Vaca here with us and hope this will be the first of many collaborations. I'll hand the floor over to Dr. Vaca. Thank you.
First of all, I want to start by saying thank you for having me here. It really is a great pleasure and honor for me to be here. As Dr. Rishi had mentioned, that I was here at UCI for several years, about 13, 14 years before I ended up making a move to Yale University. Great opportunity, lots of things going on. And now just really happy and just really fortunate, blessed to be able to come back to Irvine and try to kind of just keep moving work forward. And with this return, I've reached out to Dr. Ritchie, just to discuss how we might be able to connect and how I might be able to serve ITS, work with you in whatever capacity you would allow me to. So it's, as I said, it's a great pleasure. So I'm gonna start with this presentation today. I want to first let you know that this is going to be not a very long talk because I'd love to have more interaction with you, discussion. But I do want to let you know this is one small study in a host of a series of studies that we've completed and some work that continues to be ongoing. It's a part of a larger NIH-funded study, which is a funded what we call an RO1, Mixed Methods RO1. So I want to thank, of course, our funding agency, NIAAA, which is the National Institute for Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, and several of my colleagues, both at Virginia Tech, Yale University, Colorado State, a couple other professional research groups. So just big team, but there was a lot of work that we did, and so this is the front end of it. Please feel free to stop me as I go along if you have any questions as I do begin to discuss this about the trajectories of what we're going to call RWI and DWI, riding with impaired drivers and driving while impaired. So I'll start first by giving you a little bit of background about, we're going to talk a lot about safety, but talking about injuries as well as fatalities, et cetera, to give you kind of a broader context. So we look and remember that I'm first an emergency medicine physician as I was, practicing emergency medicine. That's what got me into traffic safety. And it's a bit of a interesting perspective because I was born in Central America, born in Panama, came to the United States in the late 1960s. My mother's a nurse and my dad is an auto mechanic. And so I ended up being a physician that does traffic safety research. So go figure. They had a lot of great influence on me both ways. So if we look at injuries and we look at, first of all, fatalities, all deaths across the United States on an annual basis. This is from CDC, the most recent CDC mortality data, 2021. You'll see across the 5 leading causes of death, each column by different age groups, okay? You'll see gray is within that unintentional injury, and injury altogether tends to be, when we look at injury, we typically divide it up into intentional and unintentional. So unintentional injuries, motor vehicles are in there, falls are in there, overdoses are in there if they can be properly categorized as being unintentional overdoses. And then the intentional injuries and fatalities are there suicide, homicide. So you see that. So across the board, if you look at all the way to the final column, all ages, just in sun, you'll see that it's the 4th leading cause of death for unintentional injury. All right. But atop the cross for the top row, you'll see for 1 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14 years old, et cetera. Those gray boxes, it's the leading cause of death. Supersedes anything else, cancer, HIV, all those things. And so then I today will be talking about what we call young drivers, which tends to be, and it's categorized as 15 to 20-year-olds. Okay. So if we look at that in the year 2021, this is what it looks like. It's the leading cause of death. And then you'll see it's injury, unintentional, and then intentional and intentional is the leading cause of death for this age group. And it's motor vehicle crashes that supersede pretty much everything else. What's not said here, and this goes across the board, internationally, nationally, when you look at injury, typically it's younger populations that succumb to that, either by disability, short-term, long-term, and or death. And it's never really in isolation. There's, really a ripple effect. If you look at low middle income countries, where the injuries occur, whether it's on motorcycles, scooters, motor vehicles, difficulty with roadways, road geometry, all that other stuff, the people that tend to die are younger populations. They often tend to be younger males. And when the young male is out of the picture, that means there's food insecurity. That means, families starve, people lose their homes, all these things. So it's really impactful. Here in the United States, very similar. It's a younger population being impacted. I'm focusing on 15 to 20-year-olds because there's a lot of transitional periods that are going on in this time and a lot of development going on. So we'll focus a little bit on, and actually a lot of it on adolescence. We hear a lot about adolescence. It can be described as a tumultuous time period, et cetera. But if you look at the scope of youth, typically most of the youth, traverse that adolescent time period without any, major events. The world typically doesn't fall apart. But there are some groups where there's difficulties either related to risk-taking, a number of other things. When we think about development in adolescence, we think also, some of us in the injury area really look at this dual paradox. And what is a dual paradox? A dual paradox is that, especially if you can understand it even more so if you have kids, and if you've raised your kids even more so. Your kids are now 14, 15, 16 years old. They're stronger and smarter than they've ever been. That doesn't mean they're like where you want them to be in that regard, but they are stronger, smarter, they're independent, amazing. But they also are probably at the most vulnerable period when it comes to the risk of injury, mortality, that is injury, death, and or disability. And why is that? Again, like any of these things, the things that you all do at ITS, there's so much complexity to this, right? It's not just the fact that they're young people and they don't know as much. Yes, that's part of it. There's neurodevelopmental pieces that are going on. So while the faculties in the brain are in place to make, certain decisions, executive decision making, some of those neural networks have not connected the way, maybe for a 30, 35, 40-year-old person, these sorts of things, all right? So the vulnerability comes at a point of risk-taking behaviors, health risking behaviors, novelty seeking, plays into this, impulsivity, as well as things like other risk-taking behaviors, and has a transition from certain, groups of people, friends, et cetera, that take them into kind of a risky environment. So unfortunately, when injury comes into play, it's all too far common of an issue when it comes to mortality, disability, injuries. And our focus is really to set them up and looking at our youth, how do we set them up so they're really fruitful and productive, what we call emerging adulthood, which takes them from about 18 through about 29 years old. Okay, so transitions are occurring. A little more background. Transitions are occurring. They're ubiquitous, all over the place. They're changing. You think about junior high schooler going into high school here in the United States. Relationships are changing. Priorities are priorities of what they think is important changes. First, it was what mom and dad thought, or my parents or my guardian thought. That changes because now I've got different friends, different friend groups. the norms change. So what's not only what I think is acceptable, but now I'm looking at what my friends think are acceptable. So we call it injunctive norms. That's really important and highly influential. Again, the transition shifts of influence from parents or their closest family members to other people that are outside of their family. And that influences decisions that really can potentially put them at risk. Further, as they transition to high school, the kids tend to go in an environment where it may be easier to get access to alcohol, drugs, maybe the first time being exposed to that, even if they're not, don't have the proclivity to kind of be involved with alcohol and or drug use, it's around them. You go to a party, hang out with friends, these sort of thing. And then these things can, kind of culminate in difficulties, especially if you wrap transportation, independent transportation, driving, riding into this whole environment. So you can see how this all comes to, this confluence comes to issues really dealing with transportation and transportation safety. So when we think about, and today I'll talk about in this one study about RWI and DWI, riding with impaired drivers, driving while impaired, quite prevalent in US high school seniors, as much as 38% for riding with impaired driver, and as much as 14% for high school seniors for driving while impaired. So while those numbers, especially the 14%, may not seem like a lot, a small percentage of a huge number is a lot of people. So 14%, and this is from nationally representative data of US high schoolers. Now keep in mind that the RWI, DWI kind of sound the same. It has to do with transportation. There's maybe alcohol and drugs involved and stuff. But the behaviors, they share some similarities, but they're quite different. For example, if you ride with somebody you believe is maybe impaired or has been using alcohol and or drugs, you can RWI, so be engaging in that type of behavior, but you could possibly be sober. Maybe the person you went to the party with is, completely, those are the group of people you went with, they're drinking or, and now you've got to get home. Don't want to wake up your parents at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning or 1 o'clock in the morning, even though your parents tell you, and we hear this from the teens and young adults, say, I don't care what time it is, just call me. But many of them will say, I'm not going to call because I know I'm going to get in a lot of trouble if I call. It's not good. But they can be sober getting into that car, but the driver is the one that's potentially impaired. Or that same passenger could be actually have been drinking and then get in the car. So there's decisions there. So it's different. Obviously, by definition, driving while impaired or driving after drinking, you have to have been that person consuming and then getting in the vehicle. So things are, quite different from that perspective. All the same, it really matters because there's a lot of things that happen anytime there's alcohol use and or drug use. If you look at all motor vehicle crashes and fatal crashes across the country, nearly about 50% of the people that die in crashes are not belted, so not restrained. The number one thing is to be in the vehicle, be restrained, okay, safe, good reasons. Maintain your body in that occupant space. Once you leave that occupant space on the crash, sometimes that is a partial ejection. Some of the most violent crashes are like high-speed crashes or rollover crashes because of the centripetal force. So you can imagine windows are down, you're driving at night, you roll over the car. If you're not restrained, you're kind of a projectile in the vehicle. You can hurt other people in the vehicle, other people can hurt you if they're not restrained, or you can be partially ejected. What that means is basically the car rolls over, your part of your body goes out, car crushes you, and then car continues to roll, you go back in the car, but you've already been crushed. Or you become a projectile outside of the vehicle and you end up against a building, struck by another car, run over by another car, or you hit some other movable object. So that's why, those things are really, being restrained is so important. And impairment has a really high level to play in that because it's really clear that those people that are impaired or alcohol, drug use, when they're driving, are far less likely to be restrained. So really key piece there. When we look at even in 2021, this is the most recent NHTSA data, fatal crash data on 15 and 20-year-olds. Over 2,000 deaths, fatalities, and while we think about numbers, a single death is not just, the impact is just not on that single person. The ripple effect across the family, the communities, these sorts of things really make a difference. As you know, unfortunately, universities, typically it's pretty common for undergraduate, graduate student, even a faculty member sometimes to have a fatal crash. And that loss impacts the entire university, impacts students, impacts administration, et cetera. So really quite devastating. But of these crashes, these fatal crashes, of those drivers that were killed, 27% had some blood alcohol in their system, so greater than 0.01 grams per deciliter. And nearly, 22%, nearly a quarter, it's 0.08. And these are 15 to 20-year-olds. So 0.08 being the per se limit from nearly all states in the United States for being unlawful in drinking and driving or having that amount of alcohol in your system, with the exception of Utah. Utah's the only state in the country that is a 0.05 level at this point in time. And just a side note, that 0.05 coming down to 0.05, even when they implemented their law in 2018, the evaluations of that policy law is quite, shown to be quite effective. Reductions in fatal crashes by about 13, 12, 14%. So really important. So, but policy moves in incremental steps, sometimes very baby steps, but still can save lives. So really significant as far as the amount of alcohol exposure there for our young drivers. Looking at some other more recent data, 2022 data, this has really nothing to do about driving, but it's just high school exposure to alcohol use. These are 12th graders. So by the time a high schooler gets to 12th grade, about 52% have had alcohol, or say they self-report alcohol use in the last 12 months, and 13% of 12th graders will admit to have binged in the last 2 weeks. So just kind of give you a sense of the exposure of alcohol that's out there. And while there are many other competing factors, whether it's opioids or marijuana, these sorts of things, the alcohol piece is kind of in that background, and then you've got kind of synergistic effects with impairment if you've got alcohol plus other things. And I can talk about that later, but we're going to concentrate mostly on alcohol and for now. So the purpose of the study that I'm going to talk now with a little bit of that background is something that we undertook a couple of years ago. We published a paper a couple of years ago. It's to identify and characterize trajectories of classes of longitudinal RWI and DWI engagement among adolescents as they transition into early adulthood. So it's a longitudinal study, but our focus, even at the front end of this, was to look and really consider, of course, we're concerned about injuries, disability, et cetera, but like what is going on with the groups of kids, the group of youth, how do they make these kind of developmental trajectories? Where do they go? What happens? Ultimately, we want to look in what happens at the back end and thinking about how can we kind of, leverage intervention strategies so we can get them to have less exposure that would put them at health risk so they can really flourish. What we say, our mantra is health, education, employment, for them to flourish in emerging adulthood. So our focus is health, education, employment ultimately, but we look at it first from the lens of, let's look at the trajectories first and try to characterize these a little bit. So the study's data set that we looked at was the next generation health study. This is a large study that started in 2009, 2010. It's multiple institutes of the NIH, pooled money together to do this large study on adolescent health. It encompassed a number of things. To our benefit, they actually looked at some motor vehicle safety, driving, licensure, and we've published several papers in this area, even some aspects of licensure, of course, alcohol, drug use, et cetera. But they looked at a number of things. They looked at screen time. They looked at risky sexual behavior. They looked at physical activity, all these things. This data set, much of it, I think almost all of it now is out there. It's publicly accessible at the NIH website, NICHD, which is the National Institute for Child Health and Human Development. So we have got in the data set was about 27, almost 2,800 10th graders. Followed them out basically 7 consecutive waves. The last wave ended in 2017. At the front end, the average age was about 16. At the back end, when the wave 7 was done, they were just about almost 23 years old. So we have some nice longitudinal data. It's a nationally representative sample. There was oversampling in the African-American population to show representativeness of the population when we're looking at this, and you can apply weights, et cetera, to that. And we looked at, the primary focus, looked at a number of things, and you'll see some of the characteristics of the population, but we really focused on RWI, riding with an impaired driver, in the last year, and DWI in the last 30 years. Again, focusing on trying to look at the trajectories and seeing, which ones are better than others and, what's different about certain groups and certain trajectories. So we first started with a late class analysis to try to identify the classes. Yes?
Can I ask what does wave mean here?
Oh, wave just means it's got an annual assessment. So if you have, take a cohort and you've enrolled them at the front end, now you've done your baseline assessment. Let's say you're gonna follow them 3 years, 4 years down the line. They were annual assessments. So, wave one, was the first assessment. Wave two is next year. You might, assess them for the same types of elements in survey or whatever you're gonna look at them for, but add other things. Wave two, the next three, so that's all what wave means. It's just a wave of assessment, okay? It's kind of lingo, there's sometimes, but we started with latent class analysis, some chi-square testing to look at some bivariate associations with characteristics and the classes, and I'll talk to you about how we came about the classes that we identified, and then some multivariate multinomial logistic regression, once again, to look at the classes, and that is the trajectory classes and some of the characteristics. So I'll kind of digress a little bit. As we said, our focus while we're doing this work is looking at health education, want to kind of understand the health education employment side. But I also wanted to put this up here to let you know that our work from the very beginning with this proposal that we had set out there was rooted in a theoretical model. So we ended up moving to the eco-developmental theory, which really has a heavy emphasis of Urie Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, all right? But it also has some other influential pieces where we not only think about the social ecological environment, the young individual that we're focused on, but also looking at relationships, the influence of relationships, as well as development and how development impacts this. Obviously, from a ecological systems theory, when you think of it, and I'll go through this, is there's spheres of influence, things that are happening around the youth, focus on the youth, spheres of influence that happen, and they kind of are central and they kind of balloon out. A microsystem, a mesosystem, then beyond that, an exosystem and macrosystem. I'll kind of talk a little bit about that. But there's also what they call the chronosystem. So, life doesn't happen in isolation. Life doesn't happen, it's not static, it's dynamic. And that's sometimes really exciting, and sometimes when you're doing analyses, it's kind of quite complicated. It makes it difficult. But as the person is being influenced, they're moving along. Yes?
We have a couple of questions from our virtual audience.
Yes.
Farzana would like to ask, how long is each wave? I think you said a year.
Yeah, 1 year.
Okay. And Cody would like to ask for the definition of trajectory as it applies to this study.
Yeah, this study is how they move through that time period of 7 waves. So where they start off and where they end up as far as the amount of engagement, and I'll talk about that amount of engagement in RWI and DWI behaviors across that 7-wave period. So coming back to this theoretical model, it's the spheres of influence. So the microsystem, you've got the teen, and there are things that are very close to that teen that influence that teen. So that microsystem is the teen and their friends, the teens and their school, the teens and their family. Those things are very kind of proximal. So things that happen in the family immediately impact the teen. Things that happen in close relationships with their friend really impact that teen. Influences their decision, their thought processes. You kind of build that out a little bit to the next sphere, and beyond the microsystem, it's the mesosystem. Now it's just one step removed. So there are other relationships that do affect the teen, still fairly proximal, but they're kind of individually operating kind of more independently. You got the family and how the family interacts with the teen's school, that relationship. You can imagine if the family has a bad relationship with the school, that's probably not going to be good at the high school level. If they have a great relationship, it might be good. Other opportunities, things that happen. Same thing, the family and their interactions or their relationship with the teen's friends, okay? If you're a parent or have been a parent, et cetera, when your kids introduce you to their friends, you kind of thin slice and you're like, good kid, bad kid, not so good. Maybe I want my kid to hang out with them. Hang out with them, that, kid's a brainiac or whatever. Hang him out, they study, go study, those sorts of things, or the opposite. So you can see that, but it's a bit removed, right? There still is influence. Beyond that is the exosystem. So now it's other types of relationships that, let's say the parent, their employment. At some level, employment really matters for the teen. If we're talking about driving, If the parent is employed, hopefully, there might be a little bit more expendable income. I can get my kid into driver education. Maybe there's a car they can participate, be able to drive and learn how to practice, et cetera. The parent loses their job, even though it doesn't directly affect that teen immediately, it's going to trickle down. Mom and dad don't have money, don't have funding, whatever. There's a lot of things change. Same thing with parents and their social support. If you're a teen and your kid is about to drive, you may be really excited about that, or you may be really scared about that, teaching them how to drive and who's going to do it? Is it going to be my wife, or is it going to be me teaching them to drive? But if you're a parent and you have friends that have already had other teens that they taught how to drive, you've got a social support network there. It's like, what did you do? How did you do this? What happened when your kid took the test? What happened when your kid failed the test? Did you go back right away? These sorts of things. So again, those are supportive pieces, but they also are influential, eventually trickle down to the teen. And then the exo, I'd say that's the macro system, which I'll talk about, is kind of this broader sphere that's going on of either cultural values, the family values, policy. Of course, there's underage drinking policies, there's teen driving policies. All those things eventually come down to bear on the youth. So this gives us a structure on how we kind of built our work out forward. So I had to say that because it's really important. Yes?
What is SES on the right?
Oh, socioeconomic status. Yeah, socioeconomic status. And so in our study, we did look at something that's very similar to socioeconomic status. We looked at actually family affluence, and I'll talk to you about this kind of a validated measure that's used internationally, and we'll look at that. Really important, because when we're looking at driving, licensure, these sorts of things, of course, finances really matter altogether. So when we undertook our late class analysis, this is what we looked at a three class model, 4 and 5 class model. The best fit for our data for this, what we were interested in, was this 4 class model. So the 4 class trajectories were abstainers, escalators, decliners, and persisters. Pretty intuitive, sounds like it is. In other areas of health and health research, particularly like in youth or smoking, they've done very similar things. Sometimes there's 5 classes, 4 classes, but it'll help us to categorize them to look at what's going on in these group of youth. So, and basically what it means is that if you're looking at the probability of the youth being engaged in RWI and DWI behavior over that 7-wave time period, the abstainers tend to have a low, consistently low probability of being engaged. That doesn't mean they're not completely, they're completely not engaged. They might have had some, but that's not their kind of trajectory. The escalators going from a low probability to a higher probability, or they escalate over time. From the decliners, just what it sounds like. Maybe they came in, and at that 10th grade time period, they were already engaged, but over the time period of 7 years, they kind of decline. Which is a good thing because of exposure, and also not just because of lack, kind of diminishing the risk, diminishing exposure, but diminishing risk of injury, other things, but also diminishing the probability of other like alcohol and or drug use disorders over time, which we know is very important. And then there's the persisters, which just kind of the opposite of the abstainers, where they consistently showing high probability of maintaining engagement in RWI and DWI. So I'm going to show you a couple of tables. We'll go to RWI first. So this kind of has our characteristics, and we show here that what we identified, some significant differences in some characteristics. Really, race, ethnicity were most things that kind of bubbled up for the most part. It's good that and we looked at Latino youth, African American, white youth. The majority of them were in the abstainer group. So I think that kind of speaks to that. Most of the teens are kind of doing just fine. It's not really that much of an issue, but still important. We also saw that the second significant proportion of classes was the decliner group. And a couple things that we identified here that were, at least for the Latino group, is we saw that the Latino youth actually had the lowest proportion out of the other two groups of being in that escalator group, which is great. And in the literature, there's kind of really interesting when it comes to alcohol and drugs. When you look at Latino youth populations, There's a couple of really large longitudinal studies that have been going on for probably more than 30 years. Monitoring the Future is one of them. But looking at junior high schoolers, and different racial ethnic groups and their exposure or their use at that time. And then there's this concept of, for some youth, aging out, where they're maybe exposed and using, and then for whatever reason, I'm not sure we understand it completely, but they kind of age out. They just kind of move away from use. And so that's kind of a great thing because, again, remember, there's no development going on. Brain is developing. There's a lot of changes that are happening. And the idea is to kind of minimize exposure so they don't end up later on with alcohol and drug use disorders. The other thing we identified is for our non-Latino white youth, unfortunately, they had the highest proportion of being in the persister group. So, and this kind of bears out with some of the other literature that's out there. So for our DWI trajectories, this is what our trajectory profiles look like. And again, once again, that 4-class model is what was our best fit for our data: abstainers, escalators, decliners, persisters. Now, keep in mind, in wave 1, we're talking about 16-year-olds, Wave 3, they're already seniors in high school, so they're 16, 17, 18 years old. And kind of think about just how every year, 1 year older, think about, underage drinking where they're at 21, they're legal to drink, and there's a lot of other issues to discuss there. But the patterns are, very similar to the RWI. But remember, this is DWI, so this is them driving, getting behind the wheel after drinking and or using, drugs, et cetera. And so they have to be, typically you hope, they've got a license, but not all teens drive with a license. Sometimes there's unlicensed driving. It's difficult. It's a difficult population to study because it happens, and sometimes they just don't get licensed, or there are many other reasons why they're not licensed. And it's a hard group to kind of try to study, even though I know some of my colleagues have tried to do so. So here for this, the DWI piece, what we identified were really some significant differences in race and ethnicity, sex, parental education. We looked at urban versus non-urban populations, and while this says rural, it's really non-urban. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm just curious. In your previous slides, you mentioned abstainer, this 4 category, and there's a probability, low probability, high probability. How do you define the probability of a person driving under this impaired?
It's really over the time period, the probability of their self-report. So this is, in a perfect world, we would have been able to bring people in, kind of confirm their exposure. I have colleagues that do dosing studies in some of their work, or they will do urine, blood tests, et cetera, so they can confirm that they actually did use. This is all kind of in self-report, but the probability of actually yes, no, because it's really dichotomous, over each wave where they've been assessed. And remember, they are not just being assessed just on one thing, RWI, or another thing, DWI, but this is kind of part of a large study where they're being kind of assessed in a number of different areas. So that, some of these questions are really buried in areas of safety considerations. Yeah. Okay.
So the probability is from the statistics.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. How likely they are to engage over that time period. Yeah. Year by year.
And the survey question was, how many times in the past year did you drive while intoxicated? Was that an example of how it was worded?
Yes, there's 2, and they actually come from the questions are adapted from the YRBS Youth Behavior Risk Survey, which is kind of CDC funded nationally study as you're familiar with. It's actually, and the time points are different. Because for RWI was in the last year, riding with an impaired driver, and DWI is actually in the last 30 days. Yeah. And the literature, is fairly consistent with that, but there are some, investigators will kind of tend to look at different things, and, even binge drinking. I'll talk a little bit about that when it comes to, well, I guess I did a little bit, binge drinking, for an adult male, adult female, the definition according to the National Institute for Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, it's probably at least for 4 or more drinks, for male 5 or more drinks, typically within about 2 hours. That's enough alcohol to take you up to about 0.08, and that's with a standardized drink. All right, because some people say, I did 30 years trauma, taking care of trauma victims, injuries, et cetera. If I ask somebody, motor vehicle crash, obviously they're intoxicated, saying like, will you drink tonight? Oh, I just had a couple of drinks. A couple of drinks could be a couple of drinks, or it could be a couple of drinks, different content. We don't know, those sorts of things. So that's why it's all kind of standardized, when they ask about standardization of drinks. Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir.
The numbers that you showed, Federico showed Black, white, Latino.
Yeah.
And then there's percentages, but the percentages, what are the percentages? They don't seem to match the numbers.
It's the proportion of those that actually were in that class, in the respective classes. So up top, the abstainers, what proportion of Latinos were abstainers, what proportion of Latinos were escalators, what proportion of Latinos in the overall. I think our ultimate sample, the next generation health study was about 27, almost 2,800, but for our population, it was about 2,500 youth. Yeah. So the characteristics that we identified were of interest, actually were significant, were in these areas: race, sex, parent education, rural, non-urban, or urban and non-urban, and affluence. So when we look at this, again, abstainers, kind of highest proportion of for each of the racial ethnic groups. We did see that for Latino youth, they have the lowest proportion of escalators, and this is within the groups, and they also have the lowest proportion of persisters. There is some literature that suggests that for Latino youth, when it comes to RWI, they tend to have a higher proportion, but for DWI, a bit less. When it comes to males and females, and this is something, again, from a broader perspective of safety, and you learn, if you're a parent, you have boys versus girls, you'll find out the boys are always kind of getting into stuff, and like you kind of, I have two boys, they're much older now, but I always felt is, doing emergency medicine and seeing what I saw, and then also doing research, and the kids I took care of, I always thought like the first thing I had to do is kind of keep my kids, the two boys, alive. They're 19 months apart, and they were together, and they're climbing walls and climbing all kinds of stuff and jumping on their bikes and these sorts of things, and it's just kind of that sort of stuff bears out. When you look at the scope of motor vehicle crashes, specifically if you look at young drivers, 15, 20-year-olds, and you look at those involved in fatal crashes, males, females, the males are at least two times, not a bit more, two and a half, almost 2.5 times more likely to be all involved in a fatal crash than females. But that is, from my perspective, developmental pieces, the way wired, other things, yes.
I like to think that the education is counterintuitive, the results based on education. Can you explain why the students or the youth with bachelor's degree or higher parents don't seem to perform as well as the
Yeah, it's actually the parents' education, not the youth's education.
That's what I meant with the parents, right?
So there is, and that's not uncommon when you look at alcohol and alcohol exposure and youth. Typically, when you look at those that are more educated, there tends to be more exposure there. Now, in this situation, it's a youth that has a parent that has a bit of higher education. You'll see that there's more escalators, there's more persisters. And as I said, this gives us kind of one look, but there are multiple things to consider. So typically, if you consider kind of finances, those that tend to be more educated may have more expendable income. They might live different types of lives in their relationships, the norms. It's more acceptable to drink, go to parties, these sorts of things that kind of put them at risk. So while it's the parent that might have that, it's the exposure that the youth may have. There may just be more exposure there. So when we're talking about behavior modeling, really important. When we talk about injury risk, even seatbelt use or child restraint use, probably the single best predictor of a child being appropriately restrained in a child safety seat is their parents actually using their own safety belt, and their seat belt. Really important. They find it is important for them to be belted, of course, then they're going to think the next thing is that they would want their young person, their infant or their child to be restrained. Over time, as the youth grows up, they see these behaviors. Dad, mom putting on seatbelt. This is what we do. Mom and dad in between times saying, listen, the car doesn't move until you're belted. Those sorts of things. So that behavior modeling is critically important, but it's also in the other directions. It's like parenting. Parenting is quite challenging, and some parents, the kind of little bit of a joke there is like, don't do as I do, but do as I say, right? It's like, you don't do this, but don't look at what I'm doing, but I want you to do that, and those sorts of things. So there's a lot to kind of dissect within there. Absolutely. Yes.
This may be getting into the weeds.
Yeah.
Has anyone done any statistical analysis on the percentages by race to see if, or even for the other categories, to see if they're actually different or they're equivalent statistically?
Yeah, we've got actually some other work that we've done, and I can send you some of the other papers that we've looked at. Yeah, absolutely. And well, like I said, with these are the graphs. I'll actually send you the full paper. Anybody that's interested in the full paper can send that along to you as well. Absolutely. Yeah. And then we also looked at affluence, and on the affluent side, which it's not an exact measure of socioeconomic status. The measure actually looks at expendable income of family. So it's an international measure that's used by WHO that was integrated into the Next Generation Health Study by the NIH. And there they kind of asked the youth about things like, do you have your own bedroom? How many computers at home? Take vacations, vehicles at home, these sorts of things that give you kind of a broader sense of the family's expendable income or how they spend their income. So again, you'll see the findings here for those with a high affluence, more kind of escalators, the proportionally, it's not just proportion, here we'll see that significant differences here, and same thing with the decliners, which is, the reason I have the green is because if you've got a higher proportion of decliners, that's kind of a good thing. You want them declining, you want them minimizing that exposure. We actually just published a study just recently in accident analysis and prevention, looking at predicting of behaviors early on, predicting later on, and their behaviors of RWI and DWI, and really kind of points to this declining. And you think about, again, we're thinking about points of intervention. If you've got a declining group, they're in high school, if the school or parents can identify that these processes are going on, they're having exposure, but they're declining, if you can identify those, maybe you can kind of bend that curve a bit more to be able to engage in some other way, whether that's identification, treatment services, on the clinical side, and or just helping them kind of minimize their exposure altogether. So that's in. So in the study overall, and like I said, I'm happy to share the entire study with you. Just ping me and I'll email to you. We are looking at the issue with engaging in RWI and DWI. Certainly, again, given the fact that this could lead to injuries, crashes, et cetera, disability, could compromise future opportunities for youth. We look at a number of other things, even licensure. We've looked at similar type of things, again, with the focus of what's going on in emerging adulthood for different youth. The RWI trajectories is really kind of most of the associations, the kind of correlational findings are there in race, ethnicity for DWI, many more demographic characteristics where those links and those associations are present. And so this is one of a kind of a handful of studies that we've been doing over the last couple of years. And in parallel, we've been working with the team. I've been working with my team and also some systems dynamic modeling, some systems science. So this, I'm just going to really just give you an idea of just the complexity when we're thinking about teens getting behind the wheel, impaired driving, and the things that come to bear, the systems that come to bear down on the youth. We published this paper last year in Social Science and Medicine, mapping the complex causal mechanisms of drinking and driving behaviors among adolescents and young adults. And so our causal loop model looks a little bit like this. And if, it's system science based. A good colleague of mine at Virginia Tech, who's a systems dynamic modeler in the engineering school at Virginia Tech, we've been working for several years on a number of things, and this is one of them. We have another quantification manuscript that's under review at the journal now that takes this model further, refined, validated, and looking at some prospective modeling of this. But this is kind of what the system kind of looks like, and you can just think of the number of things that come bear down on the teen. It's peer influence that we look at. How does peer influence play back in the positive and or negative feedback loops? It's DWI or policies of impaired driving, parent influence, enforcement that's out in the real world. This is real world stuff. Alcohol advertisements, so the alcohol industry, and when it comes to systems and dynamic modeling, it's not always necessary we're looking for predicting forward. We want to kind of model, see how the data models the historical data as we move then forward and looking at what things might be and what areas where we might be able to leverage intervention strategies like, let's say, different types of enforcement, the extent of enforcement over a different time period, different policies, how those are integrated, et cetera. And so still a lot more work to do there, but this causal loop model is a first of its kind with a lot more work for us to do. So this is kind of almost just about one of my last slides here. As we're thinking about safety, as we're thinking about impairment in driving, there's some things that we've been looking at, and in my area of work, looking at, what's going on with different population groups. I've got some great colleagues that really focus in on sex differences, and there's a lot of nuanced pieces behind looking at sex differences when it comes to injury or other sorts of things like alcohol and substance use. The slide that's here, that the blue section is actually just from about 2 months ago. I was on a conference call with the director of the National Institutes of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, and he was giving a presentation of kind of what's going on at the Institute, more recent findings. Probably for the last decade, what we've been seeing and people talking a lot about is the convergence of the two drinking patterns between males and females in the United States, saying, the curves are starting to come together, meaning that females, either males are drinking less or females are drinking more. Basically, those curves are coming together in the pattern. And what you'll see here is, let me see if I can move this out of the way here, is that the two graphics on your far right, first of all, the past month alcohol use, and this is data that goes back from 2002 to 2021. Males are kind of the yellow dots, females are the white dots, and you'll see that alcohol use in the past month, last 30 days, that kind of report is now kind of merged. And if in some populations, it's actually probably females more than males. Here you can see the overlap already. And for past month alcohol use among those aged 65 plus, you'll see the curves kind of coming together. Even for the females, it's kind of upward, slope there. And while we're talking about this has really nothing to do right now as it's up there on motor vehicle crash injuries, you can sure bet that those that are drinking more or those patterns that are changing is going to influence transportation one way or another. And those are the bullet points that we see here. Again, for this same year by year over that time period of data. So adolescents, the age groups 12 to 17 and young adults 18 to 25-year-olds, the data shows that alcohol use is decreasing, but faster for males than for females. For those young adults, 26 to 25, alcohol use is increasing, but faster for females than males. For middle adults, and I'm still in that middle adult group, so, which is good, alcohol use is increasing for females, but not for males. And what I mean, I'm in that group is by age, so I'm not on the alcohol side drinking. And then for older adults, 65 plus, alcohol use is increasing more for females than males. So just the pattern of behavior really influences how that might spill over into the transportation area and or other injury areas. When you look at those 65 and older, the number one cause of injury death for 65 and older, it's not motor vehicle crashes, it's actually falls. So it's falls, head injuries, intracranial injury, they may break a long bone, have complications, those sorts of things. So it's falls, it's not motor vehicle crashes. So you can imagine if there's more alcohol use in that population, depending on comorbidities, other things that they have going on, other medications that they take, that could really kind of synergize in the wrong direction and put them at risk. So just something to consider there. So moving forward, other things, I'm sure, at ITS, there's been a lot of discussion, or if not, there should be more discussion about safe systems approach. We're talking about safety today. And this is something that really kind of came out of the vision of, Vision Zero, and, one crash fatality is unacceptable. And the pillars of kind of these domains of really focusing on safety are the pillars that you see here in the different colors: safer vehicles, safer speeds, safer roads, post-crash care, that's called trauma, EMS care, safer people, you've got restraint use, seatbelts, helmets, but around the circle, you'll see these kind of fundamental points of understanding of where the whole system, safe systems approach really emanates from. Understanding that as humans, we make mistakes, need to account for that. Humans are vulnerable, so our bodies can only tolerate so much force when it comes to injury. And there really, when it comes to injury, it's the forces and the body's ability to absorb certain amount of force. When it can't, things break, tissues tear, etc. Responsibility is shared, so everybody participates in safety. Safety is proactive, not reactive, but proactive. Redundancy is crucial, so if you've got safe system in place, that there's redundancy in the safe systems in place. And then, of course, we kind of started with death and serious injuries are unacceptable. So critically important. So I'll open it up for questions, discussions about this, about anything having to do with, occupant safety, drivers, safety altogether. Happy to entertain questions. Yes, sir.
Back a couple of slides, if you were to, the alcohol use versus age, if you were to add in drug use, do you know if the trends stay the same by age?
I don't know, from each and every one of these groups what that's like. Of course, across the country, that's kind of a premier issue. It's really kind of the opioid use is really overshadowing just about everything, which is good because that is a priority at the CDC, the federal government, the National Institutes of Health, really important, Opioid, of course, it's not just opioids, and there's geographic differences, in what types of drugs are being used, whether it's methamphetamine in some locations, geographic locations across the use, where that's kind of the main thing. Of course, marijuana, because of all the policy things that are going on. NHTSA recently finished and published, I was just talking to Vicki about this, a study that looked at serious and fatal crashes at trauma centers across the United States. Happy to send that to you. It's a NHTSA report, and looking at the prevalence of alcohol, drug use in those fatally injured or seriously injured trauma victims in crashes. And it's pretty telling about what's out there. Marijuana is the #1 substance that's in the bloodstream across the board. And you can imagine that it's, in a lot of places, even if it's not legal in a particular state, and we kind of have to break that down legal, federally across the United States, it's illegal federally, right? But at the state level, it may be either legal for medicinal use and or for recreational use and or for both. And that makes a difference. But we know that, even surrounding states, where there's a state where there's legal use, those surrounding states tend to have uptick in use also because it spills over across state lines. When you have two states that are side by side, we know that it's no secret that, typically in states, there's a certain amount of like marijuana you can buy, and then they kind of cap you off, but you can drive across state lines and try to go get some other marijuana elsewhere. What you do with that is all the above that could potentially be happening, using it, selling it, these sorts of things. So to your point, I'm not sure really specifically age group by age group what's happening. You can fairly be sure it's probably not great because it's not just marijuana and it's not just alcohol, but it's other things like xylene, like opioids, like fentanyl. Sometimes it's known use, sometimes it's unknown use, meaning that things that are laced. And that's what we hear in the media a lot, which is quite devastating. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
You mentioned micro system, meso system, and macro system.
Yes.
I'm wondering what kind of guidance will be most effective in terms of this system? Will micro most effective?
Yeah, there's and that's the beauty of the theoretical model, right? Because a lot of times people, we start doing research, you're like, why do I need a theory? To kind of say, I can see this, I can observe these things. It gives you the idea and gives you a sense of parameters to kind of think about like how are you going to measure certain things. You can measure and then it's like, okay, was that an arbitrary measure or what? kind of numerically, but what would you expect? How would behaviors change? And what you've seen with the theoretical pieces is like, we would expect these different constructs to kind of compile or kind of end up in these types of behaviors or certain things to influence. Then you have data coming in where you can test those hypotheses, right? So at the macro system level, one thing is policy, right? So right now, and this is kind of an interesting point, is there are, for underage drinking, it's unlawful pretty much all the United States, each of the states. 21 and older, once you're 21, you can legally drink, okay? If you're underage and you're driving, essentially there are policies in all the states that are called no tolerance laws. And basically, if you're driving, and even if you're not 0.08, let's say you're 0.05, but you're 18 years old, one, you got an issue because you're underage drinking. Two, you're not supposed to have by law any alcohol in your system. So you kind of get a double whammy there. So there's other policies that can be made to help in that area to detract people from use either underage drinking. There's a huge gap that we have too. Imagine if you're, college, you're 20 years old and you don't drink, or maybe you drink a little bit, but tonight at midnight is your birthday. So the law has changed like that. So you can imagine within 1 minute, you're like, okay, it's 11:59 and I'm 20 years old. And now you step over into, now I'm 21 years old and I'm at a party and, you go from even being behind the wheel over here, you were like, no tolerance laws, right? And now you're like, oh, 0.08, okay, yes and no. That dramatic difference, that dramatic change, influences behavior, it influences what's acceptable, these sorts of things. But it also, just so you know, for everybody's knowledge, you have 0.08 as a limit, per se law, but you can still get a DWI at 0.05 or 0.04. If a police officer thinks you're impaired and you make a dangerous moving violation and suspects that, you're impaired, even at 0.04, there's a problem there, And so while I look at enforcement, there are other ways. There are other behavioral interventions. There's some, groups that need treatment services. So there's a whole bunch of other work to be done on that side too. It's not just the enforcement piece. But when we look at prevention, we talk about several different E's. E's of prevention. That's the letter E. So one of them would be EMS, emergency medical services. Something happens, injury, we want to get them to the care that they get medically. Engineering, phenomenal. I mean, the fact, now even in the time that I practice emergency medicine, dramatic differences in engineering of vehicles, phenomenal. And some of the questions that I would see, the paramedics bringing in, here's a picture, doc, here's a picture of the car, destroyed. The car's upside down, here's a tree and upside down. And the driver was belted, pushes the sunroof, they're upside down, unbelt, and they slide out through the sunroof or the moonroof, and they walk away. They got scratches and stuff like that. We still see them, but no injuries. That occupant space is maintained. You have crumple zones, engine drops so it doesn't blow into the person, airbags, curtain airbags, frontal airbags, these sorts of things are just, incredible. So engineering. Other pieces are education, of course, informing, really important, and environment. And that's just not environment of, that is kind of the context, like meaning the alcohol, drinking environment, but also is like when we're talking about roadways, road geometry has a real big, makes a big difference on where these motor vehicle crashes happen, rural, urban, road use, these sorts of things. Enforcement is one of those E's that's on that macro level, and you can kind of drill down all the way. Influence, like even at the micro system, when you're talking about a teen, there's a whole bunch of prevention programs of all sorts where it's either peer-to-peer interactions, peer-to-peer counseling, peer-to-peer education. That's at that micro level too. That makes sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yes.
It's interesting to think what other transportation alternatives people might have if they didn't want to ride with an impaired driver.
Absolutely.
So they don't want to call their parents, but maybe they could call like an Uber or Lyft if they could afford
Absolutely.
it. If there's public transit, right? Like
Yeah.
that's safe that late at night. So those are things that maybe as transportation planners, we might be able to like help provide more.
Absolutely, 150%. And the better thing to understand is, you know, like, I will always go back to the complexity of that, right? So geographically, I mean, even in our population, we actually just finished some qualitative work, 105 in-depth interviews of a subset, a proposed sample of each and every one of the same teens that were in this group. Now they're 26 years old, 27 years old, went back, and we get them to reflect on what was it like for you in high school, after high school. Now that you're like 25, 26, some have their own kids, some, you know, are working, some are finishing college, and they'll tell you, they're like, yeah, there was no Uber in South Dakota where I live, no Uber. Or their college are like, yeah, Uber, we can call Uber, but I only have so much money, and then I can't Uber anymore. It's really expensive. So those realities, you've got other micromobility pieces, but then you have to kind of take in consideration, you know, you've got the scooters, you have other things, and then they're going to a bar, get on a scooter. Now you've got an impaired scooter driver, you know, no helmet, those head injuries, those sorts of things to consider. The planning pieces are good because trying to make, you know, the communities more walkable, where there's more space for biking, all these other things. And then you have to take the community has to want to adopt that, right? Which is difficult. Some are just drivers and are like, no, why are you taking my lane away for a bike? It's like, now I'm spending more time in traffic. So then we get to the policy people and the battle between the policy. So it's challenging. But all those things are extremely well taken, of course. Yeah. Yes.
That's some input from our virtual audience. Farzana comments and wonders if you might share your thoughts on this. When you were speaking about unlicensed drivers, she mentions that one of the possible reasons for a driver not having a license could be the immigration status, and references the California Assembly Bill 60, which provides driver licenses to undocumented immigrants if they can provide satisfactory proof of California residency.
Yes, absolutely. And we've done a fair amount of work and actually published a fair amount of work recently just on licensure altogether, looking at really, again, with an eye towards health education, employment, thinking about transportation being a key piece in allowing teens as they, you know, move into emerging adulthood to take opportunities of, you know, health opportunities, education, employment, health education, employment, taking opportunities there because they do have some independent transportation, knowing that not everybody's going to be able to do that, but if, you know, what does that look like? So immigration status is one key piece, thinking about that, right? All those other things that come into play, you know, is it legal? What are they doing? What are they using? How are they getting licensure? Those sorts of things, exactly important. Not only that, I'll even step back a little bit further where some really neat and innovative work on the intervention side is going on, but youth that are in the, I don't want to say it's not welfare, but don't have parents, but they're actually in, you know, in a system where they're ready to get licensed. They don't have, you know, they're in a foster home situation. Now they're, you know, of age to be able to drive. They've been in foster homes all their time, and now it's like a huge amount of freedom, independence. I can now, 18, if I have my license, you know, I can get a part-time job or whatever. I can maybe move out with some friends. I can start my life, try to flourish, those sorts of things. But of course, the economic pieces you can't get away from. So it costs to get licensed, it costs to get, you know, driver's education. You got the vehicle expense, insurance, those sorts of things. Texas, Florida has legislation where in the foster home system, they actually have funding for kids for insurance, for licensure, driving, driver's education. And so I think there is, like, in some places there's moves because licensure is important. It's great if, you know, even if where we live, California, if it was, I mean, I was in Connecticut for, you know, 13 years. I basically, if I wasn't working in the hospital, I pretty much every morning I just, you know, drive a mile and a half, park my car and jump on the train. I'm training in to work in and out, or I can go the opposite direction to New York. The world is very different out there. You know, really don't have to drive that much at all. But those are very select areas of the country. New York, it's like that. You know, we have some of that in Connecticut as well. Chicago is a little bit like that. And then you have to take into consideration safety issues too. But yeah, great point.
Thank you. Cody asks, he comments, thank you for your presentation, very insightful. He's wondering if the accessibility of the alcohol or proximity to liquor stores could be incorporated or was incorporated in the study.
Yeah, so that wasn't incorporated into the study, but there's a good body of literature of densities of alcohol outlets. And for that matter, I think they've even done more recently outlets for marijuana more recently in the states that are legal. But there is a long history of looking at, epidemiologically looking at alcohol outlets and then looking at some of the differences in population groups, proximity to everything from crying to crashes, these sorts of things based on the density and the proximity to certain populations with alcohol outlets. So yeah, we didn't do that because we were looking at the trajectories.
I actually had a question, and you may have touched on it and I missed it. Can you tell us, or have you found any reason you can identify as to why people decline?
We have speculation, you have to kind of, put together like, what's really kind of the nitty and gritty, kind of more granular details of decliners, what's different about them. I would say number one, I'd shoot from the hip and say it's multifactorial. It's a little bit of a, kind of a scooting out. But I would say, there are a number of things. I mean, parenting matters, cultural family values matter, norms matter for the youth. Like, what are my friends doing? You can imagine that a youth that like their friends, their best friends, or a group of friends are not really driving. They don't really drive that much. They don't see that much of a need for it, which there is over the last 15 years has been a dramatic decline in teens getting licensed. We call it delayed driving licensure, and it's clearly bears out. Even more with even beyond like the population differences, population change age groups. But you have to look at a multitude of things because if I'm a teen, my friends don't really drive, and we get together, why do I really need to drive all that much? However, I also flip it and say that one of the things when we were looking at delayed driving licensure, there was at least one or a couple of papers that were saying, well, the reason teens are not driving and don't want to get licensed like they did before, like on their 16th or 17th birthday right away, is everybody has cell phones. You've got FaceTime, you've got this, you've got Facebook, and it's all social media. They don't need to get together. But when you talk to the teens and you look at studies when they do qualitative work, they're like, no, I love being with my friends. I want to be with my friends. So there's other things that are there that come into play. I think the easy part of the easy piece to say would be like, there's certainly kind of a financial piece that's there. Can I get a car? Will my mom and dad let me have a car? Or can I use their car? But how restricted will I be? There are other things also with certain kind of psychological pieces probably that have changed over years in our younger population. There's a lot of description in the medical literature about increasing proportions and prevalence of anxiety behind driving, these sorts of things where they're just not as engaged or, would likely put it off. From our perspective, when it comes to teen licensure, there's something called GDL, graduated driver's licensure. And with GDL, all the states have a GDL policy in place. They kind of go through a process of graduating from a more basic amount or basic environment of driving with somebody else that's well-versed in driving. They get some independent driving, but they have restrictions for the safety of the driver. No more than one person, sometimes more, sometimes no people in the car. Limitations, curfew for nighttime driving. We know that those two pieces are really impactful for minimizing fatal crash and serious crashes in teens as novice teen drivers. But most of the states, with the exception of about 5 or 6 states and DC, the jurisdiction, no one has any extended GDL. That means that at 18 in California, if I want to get my license and I don't want to go through this graduated process of, a couple of years till I'm fully independent, I can just wait till I'm 18, get licensed. And the DMV people that I know here in California, right now, that some of their data shows that about 70% of teens that get licensed after 18 years old. Yeah. So, but that also means that they don't get that kind of exposure to this graduated progression and those safety, like intentional safety pieces in GDL. Yeah.
We have another question.
Oh.
from the audience. Youngjin asks, I wonder if participation itself in the longitudinal study over 7 years could have influenced their alcohol drinking behavior. Could it be possible for some people to be more likely decliners than escalators as a result of participating in the study?
Yeah, I think anything is possible, but remember, these kids, their environments are changing, you know? Their environments are changing. They're like in 10th grade, 3 years later, they're cutting out of high school. So there's a whole bunch of other things like they're either going off to employment, partial employment, no employment. Maybe they're going to a junior college or a four-year university. So I would say that those that are probably going to university, yeah, they're going to get probably even more exposure to possibly alcohol use and those sorts of things. So there's, certainly that individual variability exists. But then they kind of move in, thereafter, into different stages, and that's why we wanted to do that qualitative follow-up to see where they were. And so we have some other findings there and some other work on the qualitative side. So.
We haven't taken any.
Yes, sir.
Just wondering, has anyone done any disaggregation of the data by state, specifically for California, to see if there's enough data to reach meaningful policy intervention conclusions, specifically for California, for example?
Yeah, using the next data, the next generation health study, not that I know of, looking, because huge study, nationally representative, and I'm trying to think back if California, I'm pretty sure California had some participation in that, but I don't know if the sample size is big enough in that. However, when it comes to, we did publish a study just recently looking at states across the country and looking at the policies, the different policies that are alcohol related for impaired driving, and which states perform the best. And as you can imagine, the states that have kind of more restrictive policies tend to perform the best. And I mean, performance is reductions or lower alcohol fatal crashes, injury and fatal crashes. I can send that to you too. Yeah, I did that with my colleague at Virginia Tech, with our group. Yeah, really important. But that's kind of finger on the pulse, like what's going on, what are the trends, what's working, what's not working. We call kind of positive deviance, meaning like, they're deviating towards like really beneficial things versus a negative deviance, and things are kind of going in the wrong direction. There's a big push after Utah. There is a push on the policy side for other people to, really take a hold of the 0.05 level. But there's a lot of other competing factors, probably most of them being, financial more than anything else, So, but it's well-founded because, many parts of the world have gotten it and they got it right. Now, Australia is one of them. They got it right with 0.05 and below, years ago, before even Utah came to it, with reductions in their studies and their evaluation studies, reductions in alcohol fatal crashes by as much as like 14%, so. Yes, sir.
Sorry, I missed something.
No, that's okay.
So the positive impact in Utah and other countries that are using the 0.05, like what's the mechanism that people are theorizing for it? Is it simply the fact that the number was lowered, or the increased, well, not increased enforcement, but the increased number of violations of the
Yeah, I would say yes. So you're absolutely right, because, policy comes in, we have a lot of policies on the books, but if they're not enforced, it's as if they don't exist, right? So it's not just the policy. So it's the policy, it's the education about the policy that gets disseminated. Typically policies come in, even looking at the policy, looking at effect, there's a lag of a year or more before really things take hold. And it's not just the policy, but it's the education, it's the dissemination. So you can imagine if California went 0.05 or something like that, it's going to be California DOT, Toad's almost shaken, and the rest of his group is going to be saying, this is where we've got to go. Office of Traffic Safety, this is where we've got to go. Community leaders, city leaders, this is where we're going. But there's also that potential of, enforcement, also with enforcement stepping up, identifying, it's like, did you know things are changing? Did you know, so all those things come into play. Yeah, yes.
Just kind of a follow-up on that. I wonder, are people very good at determining their own BAC? I don't.
Great question.
Yeah.
So great. I love it. It's great. So actually, so this is one of the themes that came out of our qualitative work, really, and there are some other work that has shown this. So there is this thing of, we have a couple themes that kind of emanated from this. It's trust, self-trust, and trust of others. Trust of known others are two things. And we see this. And so when you ask youth or young adults in this time, because they were about 25, 26, and getting them to reflect, like, in the situation, tell me about, last time you RWI, DWI, or whatever, what was it like? What was going on? Why did, how did you step into this situation? Many times when they did, the reflection is like, this is my buddy, Uriah is my buddy, we hang out all the time. I've seen him, when things are not good, he's okay. I know he can handle it, So, but that says nothing about me. Was I drinking when I was assessing him? So really interesting. I actually had a conversation with this health economist in South Carolina. We were talking about some work, and he was doing work going into college, college campus where he was, and doing some work in bars where a lot of the college kids frequent. And so he started doing some kind of gaming kind of assessments and saying, okay, we're gonna do this. Would you bet this? Would you bet this? And 1 beer, 2 beer, 3 beers. And it's like, so you can imagine, get some, little, I would say kind of, social lubricant and like, I'm good. Yeah, I'll bet that. I'll probably win. No, you lost, this sort of thing. And the thing that stuck with me is he said, you know what, many times people think they know who they are when they're drinking, when actually they're very different after they've been drinking. They're not the same person. So if you can imagine just like at a basic level, it's like you're trying to make an assessment of somebody else. If you've been drinking, all right, make an assessment and trying to recall and say, I think he's okay, but he's like stumbling or tripping and but you're impaired potentially to some extent. So there is this self-trust that kind of supersedes like, safety, their concept of safety, especially with that proximity of relationship. That's one thing. There's also there's a trust of others. There's also the self-trust, like, yeah, I knew that like I could probably be okay, or like, no, if I would have had 2 more, no way could I have done that. They've already been over, impaired. And then also kind of comes, you just don't know what's going to happen when you're on the roadway, partly, But that, to your point, there's a lot of effects, but to your point, yeah, there is this sense that's really common about trust of known others and self-trust of what that is. And how you kind of rectify that or try to improve that is, yeah, there's some education pieces to try to dispel some of these ideas about how alcohol physiologically affects you. It's a central depressant, and it's a disinhibitor. So, as you know, that's why it's sometimes called, alcohol kind of liquid courage, because the people that are quietest or like don't, really say too much, you take them to a party and, have some alcohol and all of a sudden they're like the life of the party. They're so talkative. It's like, man, I didn't know you were like that. It's great. Everybody loves you. It's like, really? Like, I didn't know that, the next day, those sorts of things. So the disinhibition really matters, behaviors, those sorts of things. But getting them to understand how, physiologically how alcohol plays into your body, decisions and physiologically. Yeah. I don't think we do enough of that because we think everybody does it, everybody knows it. But every year, you guys get a new cohort of freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors, graduate students. Every year there's more people have to learn. And I'm always interested when I talk to undergraduates and we talk about other health related issues, and prevention and other health risking behaviors. And like, really? I didn't know that could happen. Absolutely. Like, how old are you? 21, 22 years old. Yeah. Well, let's sit down. Let's talk about this. So there's plenty of room for that. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question off topic.
Yes.
Kind of related, but it's off topic because it's related to an area of interest of mine.
Yes.
Having to do with heavy duty truck accidents.
Yes.
And drivers of those trucks. Has anyone, to your knowledge, done any work similar to this, but specifically for the drivers of heavy duty trucks?
Yeah, and so when we think about impairment runs the gamut of course, alcohol, drugs, and you can be sure heavy duty trucks, there's marijuana going on, and now, there's a whole bunch of stuff there, even how to enforce that, like a company can enforce that on the drivers, yes or no, these sorts of things. But there's also drowsiness, which is a huge place that doesn't get enough play altogether. Sleep apnea, which precipitates, drowsiness, and even work, the amount of work, the amount of driving that they do. They have set limitations on how many trips, how many hours consecutively they can do. Some stick to that, some don't. Some get forced into driving longer because they know they're gonna get penalized financially if they don't make that trip. Or they just may not get asked by the company to take the next haul. Because you know what? You said you had to sleep 2 hours in between this time period. I need something now. You didn't help me. I'm not going back to you. I've heard truck drivers say this, so really challenging. So I don't think anybody's done something like this, but impairment, certainly drowsiness is a big deal. Sleep apnea, huge consideration, absolutely thinking about the trajectories. And you could consider that probably, I'm sure like federal highways, they probably have, data on this as far as substance use and what that matters. And you can be sure that the private companies like UPS, FedEx, they keep track of some of this stuff, because people get let go and why did they get let go? But that's going to be a different issue trying to get some of those data, so the proprietary nature. But it's even in my clinical care, I've taken care of commercial drivers that have had issues based around impairment. And for me, as a physician, when I was doing that, I'm there to take care of them, make sure they're okay, make sure they're safe. Their world blows up as soon as they leave the emergency department because now it's an occupational health issue, it's a potential workers' comp issue, potentially drug testing and loss of position. So it's huge.
I guess there could also be some interest in the future of autonomous vehicles, what role they'll play in helping with this issue.
Yeah, that's a huge area there is, and the hope is, I think it's quite a bit behind the time now. I mean, as far as their sequence, but probably more than a decade and a half ago, which hopefully this is launching. And actually, there is, if you, I can send you on the NHTSA website or the federal website. If you've ever heard of the DADS program, I think it's DADDS, and it has to do with all these technologies having to do with impairment integrated into the concept vehicle. That concept vehicle was supposed to have come out and been launched probably about 15 years ago. So now there's legislation. NHTSA there's a ruling, so you can comment on. It's on the Federal Register right now. I don't know if I think it's open till the end of the month. But the DADS project, this is what we're going to do. So the whole idea is, if the federal ruling comes in, federal motor vehicle safety standards, it's like all the new cars are going to have these types of technologies to reduce impairment. So back then when it was being launched, it was transdermal qualitative sensing of alcohol. So you get behind the car, you put your hands on the wheel, transdermal, assessment. Quantitative more difficult. Maybe the technology is better now. The sweat has this amount. This equates to 0.05, 0.08, whatever. Ambient air assessment, qualitative. That's been around for decades. If you ever drove through like a checkpoint at night, the police officer, they tell you that you keep going, you go over here. They want to assess. You get assessed. It's nighttime. Got the flashlight. Roll down your window. Yes, officer. Oh yeah, hi, we're doing this, just making sure everybody's safe, whatever. But the end of his flashlight, he's got a passive alcohol sensor. So he can sense that just a qualitative assessment. And at the back, he'll say, positive, negative, whatever. It's qualitative, but enough suspicion to get you out. Let's do a field sobriety test. All right. There are other things with drug field sobriety tests, also alcohol sobriety tests, and they're trying to kind of match things up to be more accurate. So there are police officers that get trained to do this, DREs, drug recognition experts. It's very complicated. People are always trying to say, are the assessments, are they good enough? These sorts of things. So that's always a battle there. But those technologies, as well as ignition interlocks. So, now you have, you can kind of have ignition interlocks that they connect to the car. If you have a DWI and you have to do that, and you have to blow into a thing the car senses, and if you're not drinking, you can drive, these sorts of things. But this has gotten much more sophisticated. Yeah. And policy plays into all of that. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for
Probably keep Professor Vaca here all day, I think. We need to wrap up and let him go.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation and so many fascinating areas, I think, for exploration for us as transportation engineers, and so many questions that we look forward to future collaboration
Yeah,
on,
great.
and lots of opportunities, I think. So thanks again for spending your time with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for, yeah.
And thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you.